expectations dimension in the instruction domain. This dimension focuses on ensuring that high expectations are consistently and systematically communicated and expected as part of the classroom and school culture to develop goal setting as a lifelong skill. Achieving expectations is the first of 5 dimensions in the instruction domain, Dimension 2.1. The overall definition states that the teacher supports all learners in their pursuit of high levels of academic and social emotional success. There is a direct correlation between high expectations and high levels of student performance. The overall goal is to ensure that students are achieving at their highest potential and connecting learning. When we think about what we've heard so far, this dimension is focused on 2 key areas: high expectations, tied to what students should know and be able to do, and as a result of this, all-around student success. We see additional connections to the standards and alignment objective as the expectations are initially tied to the learner outcomes and results. While we know that the research on achieving expectations consistently shows that there is a direct correlation between teacher expectations and student performance, a question for us to consider is, do teacher expectations affect student performance? One piece of information tells us that teacher expectations do play a significant role in determining how well and how much students learn. Also, students tend to internalize the beliefs teachers have about their ability and rise or fall to the level of expectation of their teachers. And last, a characteristic shared by most highly effective teachers is their adherence to uniformly high expectations. They refuse to alter their attitudes or expectations for their students, regardless of the student's race or ethnicity, life experiences, and interests. There is, therefore, a direct relationship between achieving expectations and student performance. It is critical to recognize and value the role teachers play as contributors to a learning community with high standards of performance for self and others. Let's look at the link to the Texas Teacher Standards as they relate to this dimension, achieving expectations. The standards are noted in Texas Administrative Code, Chapter 149.1001. Standard 1, Instructional Planning and Delivery, is tied to this dimension of achieving expectations in that the indicator states, teachers set high expectations and create challenging learning experiences for students, encouraging them to apply disciplinary and cross-disciplinary knowledge to real-world problems. Another direct correlation is with Standard 4, the learning environment. This indicator states that teachers maintain a culture that is based on high expectations for student performance and encourages students to be self-motivated, taking responsibility for their own learning. These 2 standards and indicators directly tie to the achieving expectations dimension of this module. We're now going to look at the achieving expectations dimension of the T-TEST rubric and make connections across the proficient, accomplished, and distinguished performance levels to clarify the descriptors of the rubric. For the first continuum of descriptors in this dimension, teachers are intentional about providing opportunities for students to understand what high expectations look like in various contexts and structure time for students to set high academic, social, emotional, and behavioral expectations for performance. The second continuum of descriptors are of paramount importance as they focus on what the students have learned as opposed to what teachers have taught. Teachers must first know how evidence will be collected to show students' mastery of learning, including learning over time, as it relates to mastery of the learning objectives. The key questions are, What do I expect students to know and be able to do as a result of this lesson, and how will I know that this has happened? This evidence is tied to both formal and informal data, assessments, and specific tools to measure learning. The evidence is also tied to both specific learning objectives during the lesson and learning that occurs over the course of the year as a profile for mastery of all expected standards and objectives. The third continuum of descriptors addresses student mistakes and self-monitoring. Self-monitoring requires students to be active in their own learning with a responsibility for assessing and evaluating actions and behaviors against the expectation. This is a critical life skill which will benefit students in the long term. Students who are expected to measure and act on modifying their actions through self-correction will target new actions in the desired direction. Students need to be taught how to self-monitor their academic and social emotional behaviors. They must first know the expectations as described in the first two descriptors of this dimension and why these expectations are important. The last continuum of descriptors focus on how students monitor their own learning, set goals, and monitor progress over time. This descriptor addresses how students engage in goal setting to improve student performance and results. Goal setting is a critical component of achievement, motivation, persistence, and focusing direction as students work to perform or attain goals. Students are more likely to commit to reaching their goals when goals are specific, measurable, attainable, timely, and moderately difficult. Students' confidence and self-efficacy also increases when they see progress. Therefore, self-monitoring and establishing milestones is an important element of the process, including making decisions about how to alter their strategies so that they move closer to the goal when presented with options and those options aren't working. In addition, the goal-setting process explicitly connects teaching and learning and allows teachers to also see how their instructional practices and performance needs to shift in order to address students' needs. We sometimes hear from appraisers that the achieving expectations dimension is difficult to interpret. We're going to look, therefore, at the descriptors of this dimension and clarify what some of those behaviors might look and sound like. Descriptor 1 reads, provides opportunities for students to establish high academic and social emotional expectations for themselves. Take a minute to read through the clarification of this descriptor. The first paragraph clarifies that teachers must be clear about what the expectations will look like, and the teacher also provides direct modeling and concrete examples in order to help students understand what these behaviors are. The second paragraph helps us understand that teachers also assist students in identifying the steps necessary to achieve the desired outcome and provide some exemplars that help students understand what the behaviors will look like when they are achieved. The second descriptor states, persist with the lesson until there is evidence that most students demonstrate mastery of the objective. Again, take a minute to read through the clarification for descriptor 2. This descriptor is all about persistence towards mastery of the objective. It emphasizes that teachers know where the gaps are and address those gaps so that students are successful. Checks for understanding and modifications happen during the lesson and subsequent lessons in order to meet the learning needs of all students. Teachers also understand and design instruction so that it does move from basic to complex. There is also a clear understanding of the readiness skills and the supporting skills as learning is designed. Last, learning is assessed for all the objectives and sub-objectives that are presented in the unit of study. Descriptor 3 states, anticipates student mistakes and encourages students to avoid common learning pitfalls. Take a minute to read through the clarification. What is implied in this descriptor is the teacher has strong content knowledge and expertise related to the area of study. When a student is confused or makes mistakes, the teacher consistently and quickly addresses those mistakes through academic feedback and questioning. The environment is also one where students are encouraged to take risks and learn from their mistakes. They are also encouraged to self-monitor and self-correct these mistakes. Last, descriptor 4 states, establishes systems where students take initiative of their own learning and self-monitor. Read through the clarifying paragraph. We hear some of the same language where students are encouraged to take risks, they're setting short and long-term goals, and they're thinking, problem solving, and strategizing in order to reach these goals and have the biggest impact. Students are therefore taking initiative of their own learning and self-monitoring their progress. Because high expectations is a big part of the achieving expectations dimension, it's important for us to think about considerations for students and how they will self-monitor. One initial consideration is to define the behavior or expectation in order for students to self-monitor. Also, identify a method for self-monitoring and how the data will be collected. Also, communicate the self-monitoring schedule, for example, daily at the end of class, and whether it will be teacher cued or the student's responsibility to self-assess. Another consideration is to identify reinforcement, rewards, validation, and feedback loops, both teacher and or peer, in order to help provide students with external data about their progress. Determine how periodic checks will be established and communicated at both the teacher and individual student levels. This may include random spot checks by the teacher. And last, as learning outcomes are met, establish new expectations as a cycle of continuous improvement and refinement. This is definitely aligned with the expectations for the T-test process. Some additional considerations for the achieving expectations dimension is how T-test is aligned to practice. First, Teachers believe that all students can achieve at high levels and establish expectations which clearly and consistently communicate this message. Teachers effectively communicate goals, expectations, and objectives to help all students reach high levels of achievement. Teachers set high expectations and create challenging learning experiences for students, encouraging them to apply disciplinary and cross-disciplinary knowledge to real-world problems. Teachers also model expectations for learning using varied strategies, including think-aloud models to assist students in understanding the cognition and thought process behind each step of the new learning. Ideally, we're also seeing that teachers consistently involve students in establishing high expectations for performance through ongoing communication of what they are expected to know and do, and regularly provide opportunities for students to review current performance compared to desired goals and outcomes. Students are provided with strategies to self-monitor their performance and evaluate the cause and effect relationship for those strategies, actions, and behaviors that contribute to their successes. And last but not least, the school and classroom culture are aligned to send a consistent message about goal setting and monitoring their progress over time. This includes staff goal setting and as a means of modeling the expectation for high levels of achievement and continuous learning at all levels of the organization. From an appraiser perspective, what are some questions that help guide appraisers? First, how are students consistently provided with opportunities to set high academic and social-emotional goals for themselves, including monitoring progress towards these goals? Also tied to achieving expectations, how do teachers communicate to effectively support students in goal setting and progress monitoring results? And one last question to guide appraisers is, how is mastery of the discipline communicated to students so they are clear about the learning expectations? These and other questions help the appraiser think about the actual behaviors that should be present for this dimension of achieving expectations. Still thinking about questions, here are some conference sample questions for appraisers to consider related to the achieving expectations dimension. First, why is it important to have academic expectations that are high and demanding for all students? How will high expectations be evident in the lesson? How will you know that most students have demonstrated mastery of the objective? What might this evidence look like? How will students take initiative for their own learning and self-monitor their progress? What structures will you need to plan and implement in order for this to occur? These are just some conference sample questions in addition to the ones that were provided during the 3-day appraiser training. As we wind down this module of the Achieving Expectations dimension, let's review the salient points that were embedded in the dimension and the descriptors. First, we know that it was centered around establishing and setting high expectations for learning. Also, that it was tied to academic, social, emotional, and behavioral expectations. It also addressed persistence of the lesson as students move towards mastery of the learning objective. We also heard about anticipating mistakes and common learning pitfalls to ensure that students are successful with learning. And finally, that students will self-monitor and that there is goal setting that's happening. Given what was presented in this module, what are your next steps to grow and develop in this area? We thank you for joining us with this module and look forward to seeing you at the next.